Welcome back, everyone. This is Paris IAS Ideas. Our last speaker for today is Professor Cui from the School of Public Policy and Management at Tsinghua University. He's also one of the founding faculty members of the Institute for Advanced Studies in that university. His research has focused on the contemporary political economy of China's reform and opening up to the world since 1978, as well as the relevance of the China's development to the theory of modernity in general. He is currently serving as an academic committee member for the Holberg Prize and the Falling Wall Prize, and he was a fellow at our institute in 2020. Yes, the talk is called Interrogating Modernity, Hans Blumenberg and Roberto Unger compared. So thank you so much, Professor Cui, for being with us today, and please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Paulus, for your very nice introduction. I'm very happy and grateful to be back to the Paris Institute for Advanced Studies. Today, I'd like to share with you a new research project, Interrogating Modernity, Hans Blumenberg and Roberto Unger compared. My idea is still in the very beginning, in the early process of development, so I very much appreciate and look forward to your comments and criticism. So first, I like to say about this title. So why bother to compare these two persons' theory of modernity? The Hans Blumenberg is a German philosopher who was born in the 1920s and died in 1997. I think there's a simple, maybe the most superficial reason to be interested in both Blumenberg and Unger, which I will say a few words in a moment, is that they are very interesting persons. They are very interesting personalities, even on the verge of idiosyncrasy. For example, in the 2018, there was an interesting German documentary film about Hans Blumenberg. That's about 30 years after his death in 1986. And sorry, this I cannot see. Is that possible to move the sheet? And in the 2022, also after more than 30 years of his death, his possible self-understanding was published in Germany. And Roberto Unger is also an extremely interesting personality. And in this picture, you can see President Lula of Brazil honors him together with a group of military generals in Brazil, because this surprised people who know Roberto Unger, because he, at the age of 28, became a full professor at Harvard Law School, but he is originally born in Brazil. And he is leading legal and political theories at Harvard. And he took a leave of absence 2 times to serve as a minister for strategic affairs under the President Lula. And he is fond of saying, to die only once. So what does he mean by this? Because he basically, he understands the human condition as 3 major components. One is that mortality. Everyone has to face death. Another one is the groundlessness, that we cannot understand the reason of being, like a reason why the universe exists. So that's the meaning of groundlessness. But third component is that given our mortality and our groundlessness, we suffer from this insatiability of desires. So given these conditions, he developed a kind of philosophy of life. He summarized it as trying to avoid many small deaths. Like when we grow up, we become more frozen about ourselves, and so we are undergoing a series of small deaths. We should prevent them. We should try to avoid that, and to die only once. Of course, how he developed his ontology and his epistemology to support this philosophy of life is one of the reasons being interested in him, in his theory. But as I said, this is a superficial first reason, because Blumenberg and Unger are both interesting personalities. But more fundamental reasons, more important reason, but by the way, yesterday I went to a company bookstore near University of Sorbonne, just near our Paris Institute for Advanced Studies. And in this bookstore, I saw some French translation of this very new translations of Blumenberg's book. So it shows beyond the German and the English-speaking world, in the French-speaking world, Blumenberg's interest is getting a momentum. But now I say it's a more fundamental reason to be interested in Blumenberg and Unger and compare their visions of modernity. I try to say that there are two reasons. The first reason is that for both Blumenberg and Unger, the human progress is possible, but not inevitable. So this is one of their key points about modernity, which distinguish them from quite a popular postmodernism theory of the last 40-50 years in the West. And so they confirm the value of modern progress. Simply it's possible to have a human progress, but not inevitable in the sense there is no higher laws governing human history than human self-assertion itself. I think this is this first reason, I mean, theoretical reason to be interested in both of them has been emphasized by an important American philosopher of pragmatism, Richard Rorty. So in the 2021 book, Richard Rorty basically argues that pragmatism, basically in the tradition of Hans Blumenberg's, the study of modernity, and this spirit of modernity is carried through pragmatism. And Richard Rorty's understanding of pragmatism is fundamentally the same as Blumenberg and Unger. It's basically, as I quote, will human life be better in the future if we adopt this belief, this practice, this institution, but there is a second theoretical reason to be interested in both Blumenberg and Unger and compare their regions, which I think is their similarities in their ontology. But this may be given the limit of time and the preliminary stage of my own thinking on this second reason to be interested in both of them. So I may not have time to go into this similarity in their ontologies. So now I briefly emphasize this, their common point about possible human progress, but not the inevitability of human progress as a defining feature of modernity. And yes, it's interesting to note that Habermas, in his 2019 book, that's also a history of philosophy. I mean, originally published in German and has just been translated into English and published in English 2 months ago. But this quote in the German language, and that's basically Habermas here emphasizes that in the whole Second World War German philosophical scene, only Habermas himself and Hans Blumenberg had something positive about modernity to say. So I think that's Habermas associated himself with Blumenberg against all other German philosophers, including Heidegger, Carl Schmitt, and all others, because Habermas think they are all too negative about modernity. But this, of course, is due to very complicated reasons. And the whole postmodern thinking of last 40 years, I mean, may have some good reason to begin with. I think this is that's because this postmodern critique of modernism is that they think modernity emphasizes the inevitability of human progress, which, given the tragedy of the 2 world wars and the massacre of the genocide in this period, it is almost nonsense. They think the postmodern people think to talk about inevitability of human progress. But Blumenberg and Unger actually emphasize inevitability of human progress is a misunderstanding of modernity. And this maybe sounds a little bit too academic, but in his leading most important book, published in 1966 in German and translated into English in 1985, Blumenberg's the title, the book, The Legitimacy of Modern Age, he defines modern age as second overcoming of Gnosticism. So this Gnosticism is the early school of Christian heresy. And Augustine is supposed to be the first overcoming of Gnosticism. But according to Blumenberg, Augustine's overcoming of Gnosticism was not successful. But what's the nature of Gnosticism? I already simplified to say that it's basically a dualism, because the main problem is that Gnosticism challenge the Christian Orthodox that the God as creation and the God of salvation cannot be the same God, because it's very difficult to make sense the existence of evil in this world. So if God as a creator of everything, is all powerful and benevolent. How come we see so many evil and bad things in this world, and God has to go through the trouble to save the people again? So this seems, so Gnosticism seems say this is against. So if we think this God of creation, the God of salvation is the same God, it is an internal contradiction. So Augustine tried to overcome it, which is not successful according to Blumenberg's sophisticated argument, which I have no time to go through it in detail. But the second overcoming is basically that because in the late medieval age, Augustine's thinking has run into trouble because of the challenge of so-called nominalism. The nominal is a very sophisticated, complicated medieval philosophy. Like leading thinkers of this nominalism is William Ockham. But basically, it's about thinking through the full implications, the infinity and the all-powerfulness of God. So if you, according to this nominalism, if you think through the infinity and the all-powerfulness of God, we may see we very easily to be deceived, because God has infinite power. So what exists in this world may not be the only version God created. There could be many, many other possible worlds. And so people are very easy to be fooled and deceived. So modern thinking, according to Blumenberg, is that about human self-assertion, because the world is so uncertain. We can no longer, as in the Middle Age, to be sure God has providence for the humanity. And so he reinterprets Descartes' famous saying, and this is Latin, but basically is, I think, therefore I exist. This is the most famous saying by Descartes. Like Hegel and many others think Descartes saying, I think, therefore I am, therefore I am, therefore I exist, symbolize the modern age. But postmodern criticism of I think, therefore I exist, therefore I am, as arrogance. But Blumenberg's argument is that this is not arrogance. It's what he called anthropological minimum and the threat of a theological maximum. What does it mean? That because God is all powerful and we are all so easy to be deceived, the only thing we can be certain is that, as Descartes said, at least I think I have thought, therefore I exist. So this is the only thing I can show. So this is an anthropological minimum, but it implies self-assertion. So I think because of time, I have to go very quickly. So I'm not going to say no other. But then this understanding of modernity as self-assertion and the threat, theological maximum, I mean, has some similarities with Unger's definition of modernity in his 3-volume Politics And I has shortened his 3-volume book into a single short volume. So basically, Unger's definition of modernity is a society as a human artifact. So basically, it's like Blumenberg's self-assertion. Human ourselves create the history. However, here I think this very interesting is a key point about both Unger and Blumenberg's notion of modern progress as a possibility, but not as an inevitability. But many, indeed, quite a lot of modern thinkers mistaken possible progress with inevitable progress. And the reason is that, according to Blumenberg's study, is that the modern social thought began reoccupying the position of a medieval Christian scheme of creation and its tautology, like the scheme of history with a starting point and ending point. So this notion of human self-assertion has been bounded by this notion of reoccupying Christian scheme of creation of eschatology. And this makes it into trouble, but makes the good idea of modern possible progress mixed up with the bad idea of inevitable progress. And I think Blumenberg's concept, he has a very interesting history about the concept of reoccupation. Because this concept of reoccupation of Christian scheme of eschatology comes from an analogy he borrowed from turn of the 20th century German philosopher Oswald Spengler, who wrote this very famous Decline of the West around the time of the First World War. And this pseudomorphosis is, as in the right-hand picture I show, it is basically it is a different crystalline substance happens to fill the hollow left in a geological layer by crystals that have disintegrated. It is forced by the mold to make on a crystal form, not his own, and without chemical analysis will mislead the observer into taking it for crystal of the original kind. So in other words, the modern idea of human creation, human self-assertion, and the possible progress is basically new substance, but has been forcefully fit into this pseudomorphosis, and so has been mistaken by many observers, like without chemical analysis, to think this modern idea of progress is still the same of Christian creation as eschatology. And so, therefore, there's widespread belief this human progress has to follow a predetermined law of history, such as Karl Marx, the 5 modes of production succeeding each other in the history. But even for non-Marxist, many people also accept this inevitable progress essentially commit the same mistake of this pseudo morphosis, mistaken the new crystal with the original crystal. Let me finish by giving one example to illustrate this key distinction between possible progress and inevitable progress. So basically, even for many people who are not Marxists, but still believe in the history has a predetermined pattern and governed by a higher law. For example, the widespread use of the term capitalism. So when people say the word capitalism, it seems to imply that capitalism has an inherent logic and an inherent law of capitalism. But in fact, in this paragraph from Unger's book about limited liability, central banking, and bankruptcy code of Chapter 11 of U.S. bankruptcy law, actually, I personally discussed with Unger about these three institutional arrangements. And I think these three institutional arrangements nicely illustrate that there was no inherent logic of so-called or law of capitalism. Like, for example, almost everybody would agree the modern corporation is based on the limited liability of shareholders, namely if the company goes down, the shareholder will not lose all his or her wealth, but only lose the amount of wealth he or she invested in the company's stock. But this limited liability actually could make the so-called shareholders, suppose the owner of the company, are not fully responsible for the misconduct of company's management. And in fact, Adam Smith, in his Wealth of Nations, is arguing against limited liability of companies' shareholders. And so this example, it already shows we widely perceive the corporation as seems to have an inevitable institutional form. Actually, was not the case. So Adam Smith was against limited liability. But then the most common justification for limited liability of shareholders is that without limited liability, people would not dare to take a risk, because if the company fails, they would lose everything they have. But if you look at the history, actually, at least in England, it was the liberal political philosopher John Stuart Mill, who was also a member of the British Parliament in 1855 and 56. He argued in the British Parliament forcefully that limited liability should be a general code in corporation law for the purpose of encouraging working class and the lower middle class to form companies. So this actually under the influence of the French Revolution of 1848, John Stuart Mill turned from a liberal to what he calls himself a liberal socialist. So he thinks rich people may have more capability to take a risk. So if for the rich people, it is still conceivable, like Adam Smith, with unlimited liability. With unlimited liability is really like people's responsibility coincidence with their managerial behavior. But for the working class and the lower middle class, John Stuart Mill argued that the limited liability is necessary for them to form companies and also the workers' cooperatives. So I can also go into central banking and the bankruptcy code, but due to the time limitation, I will just use this example to show that this possible progress idea has often been mistaken in modern times with the inevitable progress, and there was widespread tendency in contemporary thoughts of many different schools to consider the current institutional and imaginative arrangements as a kind of inevitable, has a kind of feature of inevitability, which I think if we fully understand Blumenberg and Unger's theory of modernity, we will challenge this view and search for better institutional and policy innovations in the 21st century. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your presentation. We have, yes, around 20 minutes for questions. Any questions from the audience? Yes.
Yeah, so I would have a question, if possible, to pose, and it's actually two questions. So one question is, what would you answer to the contemporary philosophers who are skeptical about the very use of philosophy of history? Because, of course, both Blumenberg and a lot of the works that you mentioned concern the philosophy of history, and therefore the conception of progress therein. And so what would you answer to those who are skeptical about the scientific character, let's say, of philosophy of history as a scientific endeavor, right? And the second question is perhaps linked to, I can see that both Blumenberg and Unger work on the fact that institutions may be contingent, right? So they can be formed and shaped in a variety of ways. But that tells us very little about how they ought to be shaped. So where does the normative component come from? And do they share the normative component? Thank you.
Thank you. I think they are very difficult questions, very fundamental questions. So I'm not sure I can really fully answer it, but because given the limit of time, I didn't show. Actually, in my slides, the larger part is about Unger's forthcoming new book next year called "The World and Us." This will be out by Verso in England, but at the same time in the US, which I think is he fully developed an ontology, what he calls the temporal naturalism. And this also based on his 2016 book with the cosmologist Lee Smolin on the singularity, singular universe and the reality of time. So based on this ontology, I mean, he, of course, I think but also Blumenberg, I think, would not accept conventionally philosophy of history based on the inevitable progress. So what I'm trying to say, Blumenberg actually, as early as 1966, in his Legitimacy of Modern Knowledge, already argued against philosophy of history based on the inevitable progress. And he has only the possible progress, and possible progress, we cannot have predetermined possible regime types. So maybe that's my very imperfect answer to your first question. And the second question about the value question, like given the continuity of the institutions, what is the value? So I think the value is the most common modern value, basically freedom, equality, fraternity, like the French Revolution. But I think both Blumenberg and Unger has this interesting point. In a way, they didn't say it, but I personally found it easier to make sense of this understanding of value by referring this more traditional Oxford legal theorist who make the distinction between concept and the conceptions. Or I think it's hard, right? Make concept and the conceptions. So the value is the same. The freedom, equality, fraternity. But this is the concept of the freedom, equality. But the conception of freedom, equality, and fraternity are different. In fact, are different. And but could also be different. We can have different and deepen our understanding what is the, for example, equality. I didn't have time to show because today I prepared two examples. One is about limited liability central banking I mentioned, but second example I didn't have time to mention is that during the COVID period of last few years, many countries, including the United States, has implemented a kind of minor version of universal basic income. Because in the COVID, nobody can go to work. And people, so even the US government for 2 years just gave people money, independent they are unemployed or not, because this social movement of universal basic income used to be run into opposition. So many people say, for example, in the 2017, the French socialist presidential candidate in 2017, when I forgot his name, but his advisor is Thomas Piketty, the famous French economist. So Thomas Piketty advised him to use universal basic income as a electoral program in 2017, but he failed because most people, both from the left, traditional left, and the right, traditional right, cannot make sense of this universal basic income. But during the COVID period, at least, many countries temporarily accept universal basic income. And so I think this is a new understanding, it's a new conception of equality. And also could be a new conception of real freedom, as Philip van Parijs, this Belgian political philosopher who is the main advocate of universal basic income, has wrote a book, Real Freedom for All. He argues that if we want real freedom, we need a universal basic income. So I think, I'm not sure this is a good answer or not, but that's what I think on this second value questions.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Any other questions? Great. Yeah. So if there aren't any more questions, thank you so much, Professor Cui, for being with us today. As a reminder, the recordings of all these talks will be available in our website and social media. And for those of you that are still with us, so remember, the Paris IAS Ideas is a series that will run once per month until, for now, June 2024. Next month, on December 8th, we will have two speakers, Jonathan Glaser from William and Mary University, speaking about patrimony as inalienability, and Vladimir Pinedo Zapatl from Sao Paulo University, speaking about nature can only exist where it is destroyed, politically constructing freedom as heteronomy without servitude. Thank you so much again, everyone, for joining us, and see you next month in Paris IAS Ideas.
So, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.